When I woke up after the surgery, I thought they had poisoned me. But there was no pain. For the first time in months, there was no pain. I couldn't understand why my enemy would do this. September 1944. Saipan Island burns under the Pacific sun. Fumiko Nakamura, 26 years old, crouches behind the rubble of what was once a Japanese military hospital. The building took American artillery fire 3 hours ago. The screaming has mostly stopped now. She can hear boots crunching through debris, voices calling out in English, the strange cadence of a language she barely recognizes. Her hands shake as she grips a scalpel, the only weapon she has. She has been a civilian nurse for 4 years, attached to the Imperial Japanese Army Medical Corps. She has seen terrible things. She has done her duty. And now, according to everything she has been told, everything she has been trained to believe, her life is about to end in the worst way imaginable. The propaganda films were explicit. American soldiers, she learned, were barbarians who would torture captured women, defile them, murder them slowly. Death in battle was honorable. Capture was worse than death. The instructional sessions made this clear. If capture became inevitable, there was only one acceptable choice. Several nurses had already made that choice when the Americans breached the perimeter. Fumiko heard the grenades. She knows what happened in that room. But something stopped her. Fear, perhaps, or curiosity, or some instinct she cannot name. So she hides instead, scalpel ready, waiting for the inevitable. The footsteps grow closer. A shadow falls across her hiding spot. She raises the scalpel, preparing to fight, preparing to die fighting. Then a voice, speaking Japanese with an odd accent. "We are American medical personnel. We are here to help the wounded. Please come out. You will not be harmed." The words make no sense. They contradict everything. Fumiko does not move. The voice continues, patient, calm. "We have water. We have medical supplies. If you are injured, we can treat you. Please. We are not going to hurt you." Another voice, American, speaking English. Then the Japanese translation again. "My name is Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto. I am a translator with the United States Army. I was born in California. I know you have been told things about us. I know you are afraid, but I promise you, we follow the rules of war. We treat prisoners according to the Geneva Convention. Please come out." Geneva Convention. Fumiko knows this term vaguely. Something about rules for prisoners. But Japan did not sign it, or did not follow it, or something. The details were never clear. What she knows clearly is what the propaganda said. Americans are demons. Capture means horror. But the voice is Japanese. The accent is strange, American-influenced, but the words are her language. And he is asking, not demanding. He is promising safety, not threatening violence. Slowly, hands shaking so badly she nearly drops the scalpel, Fumiko emerges from behind the rubble. 3 American soldiers stand in the destroyed hospital corridor. 2 carry rifles, but the weapons are pointed down. The third, a Japanese-American man in U.S. Army uniform, steps forward with his hands visible and empty. "Are you injured?" he asks in Japanese. Fumiko cannot speak. She stares at him, at this impossible person, this ethnic Japanese man in enemy uniform, asking about her welfare. "It's okay," he says gently. "You're safe now. Are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" She shakes her head, then nods, then shakes her head again. She does not know how to answer. She has cuts, bruises, burns from the artillery strike. She has been malnourished for months as supplies to the island dwindled. She has chronic back pain from years of bending over patients in inadequate facilities. But these seem like trivial concerns when she expected to be dead by now. One of the American soldiers, a medic judging by the red cross on his helmet, approaches slowly. He speaks in English. The translator converts his words. He wants to do a basic medical examination. Check for serious injuries. Is that acceptable? Acceptable. He is asking permission. This also makes no sense. She is a prisoner. She has no rights. This is what she has been taught. But she nods because she does not know what else to do. The medic is professional, efficient, gentle. He checks her pulse, looks at her eyes, examines the visible cuts and burns. He offers her water from a canteen. She hesitates, wondering if it is poisoned, then drinks because her thirst overwhelms her suspicion. The water is clean, cool, The best thing she has tasted in weeks. The medic speaks again. The translator says, "You need treatment for these burns and some of these cuts. We are taking all wounded to the field hospital. You will be treated there. You will be separated from male prisoners and given appropriate facilities. Do you understand?" Fumiko nods again, still unable to speak, still waiting for the trap to spring, for the promised horror to begin. But it does not begin. Instead, the medic helps her walk through the rubble, supporting her weight when she stumbles. They lead her to a truck where other wounded Japanese prisoners sit, guarded but not bound. A Japanese woman, another nurse Fumiko recognizes, sits in the truck bed, her arm bandaged. Their eyes meet. The other woman's expression mirrors Fumiko's confusion. The truck drives them to an American field hospital, a sprawling complex of tents and prefabricated structures. They are separated by gender immediately. The women are taken to a smaller tent area, guarded by American soldiers but given privacy screens and separate facilities. A female American nurse, stern-faced but not cruel, directs them to cots. Fumiko's burns are cleaned and dressed. Her cuts are sutured. She is given food, plain but adequate, more than she has eaten in a single meal for months. And through it all, she waits for the deception to end, for the real treatment to begin. But days pass and the horror never comes. To understand Fumiko's disbelief, you must understand what she had been taught. The propaganda was not subtle. It was explicit, detailed, designed to make capture unthinkable. Japanese military indoctrination, particularly for women in military zones, emphasized that Americans were fundamentally barbaric. Training films showed alleged atrocities. Lectures described in graphic detail what would happen to captured women. The message was clear and consistent. Death was preferable. Honorable suicide was the only acceptable response to imminent capture. This was not merely propaganda. It was doctrine. The concept of gyokusai, honorable death, permeated Japanese military culture. Surrender was shameful not just for the individual but for their entire family. A soldier who surrendered brought dishonor to their ancestors and descendants. For women, the shame was even more profound, carrying implications of sexual dishonor that would permanently destroy their social standing. This ideology had practical effects. During the Battle of Saipan, hundreds of Japanese civilians jumped from cliffs rather than surrender to American forces. Mothers threw their children off cliffs, then jumped themselves. Soldiers detonated grenades in family groups. The Americans, horrified, tried to stop them, using loudspeakers to promise safety, but the suicides continued. The propaganda had done its work too well. So when Fumiko and the other captured women found themselves alive, unharmed and receiving medical care, they experienced profound cognitive dissonance. Everything they had been taught was wrong. Either the propaganda had lied, or this humane treatment was an elaborate deception preceding something worse. Most believed it was deception. They waited for the other shoe to drop, but to understand why it did not drop, you must understand the other side of this story, the American side, the legal and moral framework that governed U.S. treatment of prisoners. The United States was a signatory to the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. This international treaty established minimum standards for POW treatment. Prisoners were to be humanely treated, adequately fed, given medical care, protected from violence and intimidation, and allowed contact with the International Red Cross. The convention was not perfect and did not cover all situations, but it established a baseline of civilized conduct. Japan had signed the convention but never ratified it. More importantly, Japan explicitly rejected its provisions in practice. Japanese military doctrine held that soldiers should die rather than surrender, so prisoners of war were beneath contempt. Japanese forces treated Allied POWs with systematic brutality. Starvation, torture, forced labor, medical experimentation, and execution were common. Of approximately 140,000 Allied prisoners held by Japan, about 27% died in captivity. By comparison, about 4% of Allied prisoners held by Germany died in captivity. The difference was not accidental. It reflected fundamentally different approaches to the laws of war. The United States maintained Geneva Convention standards for multiple reasons. Some were practical. Reciprocity mattered. If America treated Japanese prisoners well, perhaps Japan would treat American prisoners better. This hope proved largely false, but the principle remained. Additionally, well-treated prisoners were more likely to cooperate with intelligence gathering. Humane treatment produced better information than torture. But beyond practical considerations, there were moral and political reasons. The United States was fighting a war it characterized as a defense of civilization against barbarism. This narrative required actually behaving in a civilized manner. If American forces committed the same atrocities as their enemies, the moral distinction collapsed. The United States needed to prove that democratic values meant something in practice, not just in rhetoric. This was not easy. The Pacific War was brutal, racist, and fought with intense hatred on both sides. Japanese forces committed atrocities against American prisoners and civilians. American forces often responded with rage, sometimes killing Japanese soldiers attempting to surrender, sometimes desecrating Japanese dead. The war brought out the worst in many participants. But at the institutional level, the U.S. military maintained standards. Prisoners were to be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Medical care was to be provided without discrimination. Female prisoners were to be separated from male prisoners and given appropriate facilities and protection. These were not suggestions. They were orders, enforced through military discipline and inspected by the International Red Cross. For the rare Japanese women who fell into American captivity, this meant something specific. It meant immediate separation from male prisoners. It meant access to female guards when available, or at minimum, privacy screens and separate facilities. It meant medical care provided by professionals who treated them as patients, not as enemies or objects. It meant regular food, basic hygiene supplies, and protection from violence. It meant being treated as human beings. Fumiko's realization of this came gradually, through accumulated small experiences that contradicted everything she expected. The first major shock came 3 days after her capture. The burns on her legs, inadequately treated in the initial chaos, had become infected. She developed a fever. The American medical staff noticed during a routine check and immediately transferred her to the surgical tent. A doctor, a captain in the U.S. Army Medical Corps, examined her through a translator. He explained that the infection was serious and required surgical debridement, the removal of dead and infected tissue. He explained that she would be given anesthesia, that she would be unconscious during the procedure, that she would wake up afterward with the wound cleaned and properly dressed. Fumiko, feverish and terrified, was certain this was the end. They were going to put her to sleep and she would never wake up. Or worse, they would do something to her while she was unconscious and she would wake up to find herself violated or mutilated. She had no choice. She was a prisoner. She could not refuse. So she lay on the surgical table, felt the prick of the needle, felt the strange sensation of consciousness slipping away, and surrendered to what she believed was death. She woke up 6 hours later in a recovery area. A Japanese-American nurse sat beside her cot. The woman smiled when Fumiko's eyes opened. "The surgery went well," the nurse said in Japanese. "The infection is cleaned out. You will need to stay off your feet for a few days, but you should recover fully. How do you feel?" Fumiko stared at her, unable to process the question. She felt pain in her leg, but it was different from before. Cleaner somehow. Sharper but less sickening. And she was alive. Intact. Unharmed except for the surgical wound, which was bandaged and clean. "Why?" she whispered. The nurse's smile faded into something more serious, more understanding. "Because you needed medical care, that is what we do. We are medical personnel. We treat the sick and wounded. But I am your enemy. You are a patient." This distinction, simple and profound, was incomprehensible to Fumiko. In her experience, in her training, in everything she had been taught, enemies were enemies. They were to be fought, defeated, destroyed. The idea that an enemy could simultaneously be a patient, someone deserving care and treatment, violated her entire understanding of war. But the evidence was undeniable. They had treated her. They had saved her life. They had done so professionally, competently, without apparent ulterior motive. Over the following weeks, as her leg healed and she remained in the POW facility, Fumiko witnessed this pattern repeat. Japanese prisoners, male and female, received medical care according to need, not according to their status as enemies. A prisoner with malaria received quinine. A prisoner with a broken bone received a cast. A prisoner with dental pain received dental care. This last example particularly struck Fumiko. One of the other women prisoners, a teacher named Yuki Sato, who had been on Saipan with her family, developed a severe tooth infection. The infection caused facial swelling and fever. In the Japanese military medical system, with its chronic shortage of supplies and its prioritization of combat-effective personnel, such a condition in a civilian would have been ignored. Yuki would have been expected to endure it, or to die from it if it became septic. Instead, the American medical staff extracted the infected tooth under local anesthesia, prescribed antibiotics, and monitored Yuki until the infection cleared. The entire procedure took less than an hour. Yuki, stunned and grateful, could not stop touching her face, marveling at the absence of pain. "They fixed it," she kept saying. "They just fixed it. Like it mattered. Like I mattered." This was the recurring theme in the women's conversations. The Americans treated them like they mattered. Not like honored guests, certainly. They were prisoners, confined and guarded, but like human beings whose suffering was worth alleviating, whose medical needs were worth addressing. The cognitive dissonance this created was profound and destabilizing. Fumiko's most significant experience, the one that gave this story its title, came about 6 weeks into her captivity. She had suffered from chronic lower back pain for years. The work of nursing, constantly bending over low beds and makeshift surgical tables, had taken its toll. The pain was worst when she sat for extended periods. She had developed a habit of sitting with her weight shifted to one hip, a posture that temporarily relieved the pressure on her lower spine. During a routine medical inspection, an American doctor noticed her posture. Through a translator, he asked about it. "I sit on one hip," Fumiko explained, demonstrating. "It helps with the pain in my back." The doctor, a major with graying hair and a thoughtful expression, asked more questions. How long had she had this pain? What made it worse? What made it better? Had she ever injured her back? What kind of work had she done? Fumiko answered, bewildered by the attention. This was a minor complaint, a chronic condition she had learned to live with. It seemed absurd that an American doctor would care about it, but he did care. He conducted a physical examination, having Fumiko perform various movements while he observed and palpated her spine. He asked about her sleeping arrangements, her daily activities, her medical history. He was thorough, professional, focused entirely on understanding her condition. Through the translator, he explained his findings. She had developed muscular imbalances and probable discompression from years of poor ergonomics. The condition was treatable. He prescribed a course of physical therapy, exercises to strengthen her core muscles and improve her posture. He arranged for her to receive a better sleeping mat that would provide more support. He gave her aspirin for pain management. "This will not fix the problem overnight," he explained. "The damage took years to develop, but with consistent exercise and better posture, you should see significant improvement over time. The physical therapist will work with you 3 times a week." Fumiko stared at him, then at the translator, then back at him. "Why?" she asked again, the question that haunted all her interactions with her captors. The doctor looked puzzled by the question. "Because you have a treatable medical condition. Because you are in pain. Because I am a doctor, and you are a patient." There it was again. That distinction. That incomprehensible idea that her status as a patient superseded her status as an enemy. The physical therapy sessions began the following week. An American physical therapist, working through a translator, taught Fumiko exercises to strengthen her back and core. The sessions were professional, focused, and remarkably effective. Within a month, Fumiko's chronic pain had diminished noticeably. Within 2 months, she could sit normally without discomfort for the first time in years. This experience, more than any other, broke through Fumiko's conditioning. The Americans had not just treated an acute injury or infection. They had addressed a chronic condition that did not threaten her life, that did not affect her ability to perform any duties as a prisoner. They had done so simply because she was in pain, and they could help. She tried to reconcile this with what she had been taught. She tried to see it as manipulation, as a tactic to make prisoners compliant. But the explanation did not fit. The treatment was too consistent, too professional, too indifferent to any strategic benefit. The doctor who treated her back pain gained nothing from it. She was already a compliant prisoner. The treatment did not make her more useful or more cooperative. It just made her hurt less. The only explanation that fit the facts was the one the doctor had given. He treated her because he was a doctor and she was a patient. It was that simple and that revolutionary. Daily life in the women's section of the POW camp followed a routine that was mundane in its normalcy. This mundanity was itself shocking to women who had expected torture and death. They woke at dawn. They were given time and facilities for basic hygiene. They received breakfast, usually rice or oatmeal, sometimes with canned fruit or milk. The food was not luxurious, but it was regular and adequate. For women who had spent months on Saipan as supplies dwindled and starvation loomed, the reliability of meals was almost as important as the food itself. After breakfast, there were work assignments. The women did laundry, mending, light agricultural work in the camp garden. The work was not difficult or punishing. It was simply the routine labor of maintaining a camp. They worked alongside American personnel who did similar tasks. The Americans were not friendly, exactly, but they were not cruel. They were professional, distant, occasionally cordial. Lunch was at midday, more rice, sometimes with vegetables, sometimes with canned meat. Then more work, or medical appointments, or simply rest time. The women were allowed to talk among themselves, to write letters that would be held until the war ended, to read books provided by the Red Cross. Dinner was in the evening, then free time before lights out. The routine was boring, repetitive, and utterly unlike the nightmare they had been promised. The medical care continued to be the most striking aspect of their captivity. Every prisoner received regular health checks. Chronic conditions were treated. Preventive care was provided. When a malaria outbreak occurred in the camp, all prisoners received prophylactic quinine. When dysentery appeared, sanitation measures were immediately improved, and affected prisoners were isolated and treated. The Americans seemed obsessed with preventing disease. They enforced strict sanitation rules. They monitored water quality. They inspected food preparation. They required regular bathing and laundering of clothes. To the Japanese prisoners accustomed to the deteriorating conditions of the late-war Japanese military, this attention to hygiene seemed excessive, but it was effective. Disease rates in the camp were low. Mortality was almost non-existent. One incident particularly demonstrated the American approach. A prisoner named Hana Yamamoto, a factory worker who had been on Saipan supporting the military-industrial effort, was discovered to be pregnant. She was about 4 months along, the pregnancy hidden under loose clothing and the general malnourishment that made everyone thin. When the American medical staff discovered this, there was immediate consultation. A doctor who specialized in obstetrics was brought in from another facility. Hana received prenatal care, vitamin supplements, extra food rations. Her work assignments were adjusted to avoid heavy labor. Plans were made for the delivery. Hana was terrified. She was unmarried. The pregnancy the result of a relationship with a Japanese soldier who had died in the battle for Saipan. In Japanese society, this situation brought profound shame. She expected judgment, punishment, perhaps forced abortion. Instead, she received medical care. The American personnel asked no questions about the circumstances of her pregnancy. They treated it as a medical condition requiring appropriate care. When she went into labor, she was attended by a doctor and 2 nurses who managed the delivery professionally and successfully. She gave birth to a healthy boy. The Americans provided supplies for the infant: diapers, formula when Hana's milk production was insufficient, basic clothing. They adjusted her housing to give her more privacy. They reduced her work assignments to allow time for childcare. Hana, holding her son, wept with confusion and gratitude. "They treat him like he matters," she said to Fumiko. "Like he is a baby, not an enemy. I do not understand these people." None of them understood. But gradually, through accumulated experience, they began to accept that the humane treatment was real, not a deception. The Americans were actually following the rules they claimed to follow. They were actually treating prisoners according to some standard of civilized conduct that superseded the immediate brutality of war. This realization led to deeper questions. If the Americans were not the demons of propaganda, what did that mean about the propaganda itself? What did it mean about the government that had created the propaganda? What did it mean about the war? These were dangerous questions, disloyal questions, but they were unavoidable. The Japanese-American translators played a crucial role in this transformation. These Nisei soldiers, second-generation Japanese Americans, were cultural bridges. They spoke both languages, understood both cultures, and could explain each side to the other. Many of the Nisei had their own complicated stories. Some had been in internment camps in the United States before volunteering for military service. Some had family members still in those camps. They were fighting for a country that had imprisoned them because of their ethnicity, against a country that was their ancestral homeland. Their loyalty was questioned by both sides, but they served with distinction, and their role in the POW camps was invaluable. They could explain to American personnel the cultural context of Japanese prisoner behavior. They could explain to Japanese prisoners the American legal and moral framework for POW treatment. They humanized both sides to each other. One translator, Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto, the same man who had first convinced Fumiko to surrender, made a particular effort to help the women prisoners understand their situation. He held informal education sessions explaining the Geneva Convention, describing American society, answering questions about the war. "Why do you fight for them?" one woman asked him. "They put your people in camps. They treat you as enemies even though you are citizens." Yamamoto's answer was careful, honest. "Yes, my family is in an internment camp in California. Yes, this is unjust. Yes, I am angry about it, but I am also an American. I believe in American principles even when America fails to live up to them. I believe in democracy, in rule of law, in the idea that all people have rights. Japan does not believe in these things. The Japanese government is a military dictatorship that has committed terrible atrocities. I fight against that, even though I am ethnically Japanese. I fight for the idea of America, even when America wrongs me." This answer satisfied no one completely, but it was honest, and it illustrated a key difference between the two sides. America, for all its flaws and hypocrisies, at least claimed to believe in universal principles. Japan's ideology was explicitly hierarchical, explicitly racial, explicitly rejecting the idea of universal human rights. The prisoners began to learn about Japanese atrocities. This information came gradually, carefully, through the translators. The Bataan Death March, where thousands of American and Filipino prisoners were marched to death in the Philippines. The Burma Railway, where Allied prisoners were worked to death building infrastructure for the Japanese military. The rape of Nanking, where Japanese forces massacred hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians. The comfort women system, where women from occupied territories were forced into sexual slavery. Some prisoners refused to believe these accounts. They were propaganda, they insisted, lies to justify American actions. But the evidence was overwhelming, the sources too numerous and consistent, and the contrast with their own treatment was too stark to ignore. If these atrocities were real, and if the Americans were treating Japanese prisoners humanely despite these atrocities, what did that say about the moral character of each side? Fumiko struggled with this question. She had been a loyal subject of the emperor. She had believed in Japan's mission, in the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, in the idea that Japan was liberating Asia from Western colonialism. She had done her duty as a nurse, treating wounded soldiers, supporting the war effort. But now she learned that the government she had served had committed systematic atrocities, that the war she had supported was a war of aggression and conquest, not liberation, that the ideology she had believed in was built on lies. And she learned this while being treated humanely by the enemy she had been taught to hate and fear. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. Some prisoners retreated into denial. Some became depressed, unable to reconcile their beliefs with reality. Some, like Fumiko, began a painful process of reevaluation. "I thought we were the civilized ones," she said to Yuki one evening. "I thought we were bringing order and progress to Asia. I thought the Americans were barbarians. But they are treating us according to rules, according to law. And we did not treat their prisoners this way. We did not follow any rules." Yuki nodded slowly. "My husband was a soldier," she said quietly. "He told me once about prisoners they captured in China. He did not give details, but his face. I knew something terrible had happened. I did not want to know more. I told myself it was necessary, that war was ugly, that our enemies would do the same to us. But they are not doing the same to us. They are doing something different, something better." This realization spread through the women's section of the camp, not universally, not without resistance, but gradually. The evidence of their own experience was too strong to deny. The Americans were following a different moral code, one that recognized the humanity even of enemies. The International Red Cross inspections reinforced this reality. Representatives of the Red Cross visited the camp regularly, as they were entitled to do under the Geneva Convention. They interviewed prisoners privately, asking about treatment, food, medical care, living conditions. They inspected facilities. They documented everything. The first time Red Cross representatives interviewed Fumiko, she was suspicious. Were these people really neutral? Or were they part of the American system, performing a show of oversight while actually being complicit? But the representatives asked hard questions. They wanted to know about any mistreatment, any violations of the convention, any problems with food or medical care. They took notes. They followed up on complaints. When prisoners reported that the bathing facilities were inadequate, the Red Cross documented this, and the Americans improved the facilities. This was real oversight, real accountability. The Americans were actually following rules, actually submitting to external inspection, actually correcting problems when they were identified. Japan had refused Red Cross access to its POW camps. Now Fumiko understood why. The contrast would have been too damning. As the war progressed and Japan's defeat became inevitable, the prisoners' situation became more complicated. They were safe, fed, and cared for in American custody. But what would happen when the war ended? What would happen when they returned to Japan? In Japanese society, surrender was shameful. Prisoners of war were considered to have dishonored themselves and their families. Women prisoners faced additional stigma, with implications of sexual dishonor regardless of what had actually happened. The prisoners knew that returning to Japan would mean social ostracism, difficulty finding work or marriage, permanent stain on their reputations. Some prisoners expressed a desire to stay in American custody, to not return to Japan. This was not permitted. The Geneva Convention required repatriation of prisoners at the end of hostilities, but the request itself illustrated how thoroughly the prisoners' perspectives had shifted. They felt safer with their former enemies than they expected to feel with their own people. August 1945 brought the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, followed by the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, followed by Japan's surrender. The news reached the POW camp through official channels. The war was over. The prisoners' reactions were mixed. Relief that the killing had stopped. Grief for Japan's defeat and the destruction of Japanese cities. Fear about what came next. Uncertainty about their futures. The American personnel were professional but not triumphant. They understood that for the prisoners, this was a moment of national catastrophe, not liberation. They maintained the same standards of care, the same routines, while preparing for repatriation. Fumiko underwent a final medical examination before repatriation. The same doctor who had treated her back pain checked her condition, noted the improvement, and provided her with written instructions for continuing the exercises. He gave her a supply of aspirin for pain management. He wished her well. "I hope you can rebuild your life in peace," he said through the translator. "I hope Japan can rebuild in peace. The war is over. That is good for everyone." Fumiko wanted to thank him, to express something of what his treatment had meant to her, but she did not have the words. She bowed deeply, the formal bow of profound respect and gratitude. He nodded in return, understanding without words. The repatriation ships carried the prisoners back to Japan in September 1945. They arrived in a country devastated by war, occupied by American forces, struggling with starvation and homelessness, and the psychological trauma of total defeat. Fumiko returned to her family's home, or what remained of it. Her parents had survived the war, but her brother had died in the Philippines. Her city was partially destroyed by bombing. Food was scarce. The future was uncertain, and she could not talk about her experience as a prisoner. The stigma was too great. When people asked where she had been, she said only that she had been on Saipan, that she had been captured, that she had survived. She did not describe the medical care, the regular food, the humane treatment. To do so would have seemed like praising the enemy, like betraying Japan, but it would also have raised uncomfortable questions. If the Americans had treated Japanese prisoners humanely, why had Japan not done the same for Allied prisoners? If the Americans had followed the Geneva Convention, why had Japan rejected it? If the enemy had behaved with civilization and restraint, What did that say about Japan's conduct of the war? These questions were too dangerous, too painful, so Fumiko, like most former POWs, remained silent. She found work as a nurse again, though her status as a former prisoner made employment difficult. She never married, partly because of the stigma, partly because she could not imagine explaining her past to a potential husband. She lived quietly, worked diligently, and tried to rebuild her life in a rebuilt Japan. For decades, she did not speak about her experience. The shame of capture, the complexity of her feelings about her treatment, the cognitive dissonance between what she had been taught and what she had experienced, all of it remained locked inside. But in the 1980s, as Japan had become a prosperous democracy and the war had receded into history, some former POWs began to share their stories. Historians interested in the Pacific War sought out their testimonies. The stigma, while still present, had diminished enough that some people were willing to talk. Fumiko was in her 60s when a historian contacted her, asking if she would be willing to be interviewed about her experience as a prisoner of war. She hesitated for weeks before agreeing. The interview was difficult. Fumiko had spent 40 years not talking about this, not even thinking about it more than necessary. Bringing it all back, describing it in detail, was emotionally exhausting, but it was also liberating. For the first time, she could speak honestly about what had happened. She could describe the fear and the propaganda and the expectation of death. She could describe the shock of humane treatment. She could describe the medical care, the regular food, the respect for her dignity as a human being. She could describe sitting on one hip, and the American doctor who cared enough to ask why, and the physical therapy that had relieved years of chronic pain. "I expected to die," she told the historian. "I expected torture. I expected everything the propaganda promised. Instead, an American doctor asked me about how I sit because he wanted to fix my back pain. That small moment, being treated as a patient and not an enemy, taught me more about the difference between our nations than any battle could." The historian asked what she thought that difference was. Fumiko considered the question carefully. "I think," she said slowly, "that America believed in rules that applied even to enemies. Japan believed in hierarchy, in the superiority of Japanese people, in the idea that others were less than human. America was not perfect. I know about the internment camps, about racism, about many injustices. But at the level of official policy, America tried to follow rules. America tried to maintain civilization even in war. Japan abandoned civilization. Japan said that the ends justified any means, that our enemies deserved no mercy, that rules were for the weak." She paused, then continued. "The Americans defeated us militarily, but they also defeated us morally. They showed us what civilization actually means. It means maintaining your principles even when it is difficult. It means treating even your enemies as human beings. It means following rules even when your enemy does not. That is strength, not weakness." Japan thought cruelty was strength. We were wrong. This testimony and others like it became part of the historical record. The stories of Japanese POWs in American custody provided a counterpoint to the well-documented atrocities committed by Japanese forces. They illustrated the practical and moral importance of the Geneva Convention and the laws of war. But these stories also complicated the narrative of the Pacific War. The war was brutal, racist, and fought with intense hatred. American forces committed their own atrocities, though not on the systematic scale of Japanese forces. American society interned Japanese Americans in violation of their constitutional rights. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. The humane treatment of Japanese POWs did not erase these facts. But it did demonstrate that even in a brutal war, even against an enemy that committed systematic atrocities, it was possible to maintain standards of civilized conduct. It was possible to follow the laws of war. It was possible to treat prisoners humanely. This mattered strategically. Well-treated prisoners provided better intelligence. Humane treatment encouraged surrender, reducing American casualties in the later stages of the war. The moral high ground strengthened American legitimacy in the post-war occupation and reconstruction of Japan, but it also mattered morally. The United States was fighting a war it characterized as a defense of civilization. This characterization required actually behaving in a civilized manner. The treatment of POWs was a test of American values under pressure. By maintaining Geneva Convention standards, by treating even Japanese prisoners humanely despite Japanese atrocities against Allied prisoners, the United States demonstrated that its values were real, not just rhetoric. This was not easy. American soldiers and sailors who had seen Japanese atrocities, who had lost friends to Japanese forces, who were fighting a brutal war in terrible conditions, did not naturally feel inclined toward mercy. The decision to treat prisoners humanely was a policy decision, enforced through military discipline and oversight. It required constant effort and vigilance, but it was maintained. And it mattered. For Fumiko and the other women who experienced this treatment, it was transformative. It shattered their indoctrination. It forced them to reevaluate everything they had been taught about the war, about their government, about their enemies. It was painful and disorienting, but it was also educational. They learned that propaganda lies. They learned that their government had lied to them about many things. They learned that the enemy they had been taught to hate and fear was capable of humanity and restraint. They learned that civilization means something concrete, something that can be measured by how you treat people who are completely in your power. These lessons stayed with them for the rest of their lives. They influenced how they thought about war, about government, about international relations. They made them skeptical of propaganda and nationalism. They made them value international law and human rights. In this sense, the humane treatment of Japanese POWs was not just a military policy. It was a form of education, a demonstration of values that had lasting impact. The post-war transformation of Japan into a peaceful democracy was influenced by many factors. The American occupation, the new constitution, economic reconstruction, the Cold War context, all played roles. But the experience of individuals like Fumiko also mattered. They had seen an alternative model. They had experienced a different way of organizing society, one based on rules and rights rather than hierarchy and force. They could not speak openly about this during the immediate post-war period. The shame of capture was too great, but their experience influenced their private thoughts and their quiet actions. They raised children with different values. They supported democratic reforms. They contributed, in small ways, to Japan's transformation. Fumiko lived to see Japan become one of the world's most prosperous and peaceful nations. She saw the U.S.-Japan alliance become a cornerstone of Pacific stability. She saw former enemies become close partners. She saw the values that had been demonstrated to her in that POW camp, the values of law and human rights and civilized restraint, become part of the international order. She died in 1998, at the age of 80. In her final years, she had spoken more openly about her wartime experience. She had given interviews to historians. She had visited schools to talk about the war and its lessons. She had tried, in her quiet way, to ensure that the lessons she had learned would not be forgotten. Her story, and the stories of other Japanese POWs who experienced humane treatment in American custody, are not well known. They are overshadowed by the larger narratives of the Pacific War, the atrocities and the battles and the atomic bombs. But they are important stories. They illustrate something crucial about war and civilization. War brings out the worst in humanity. It creates conditions where atrocity becomes easy, where the enemy becomes dehumanized, where cruelty seems justified. Maintaining civilized standards under these conditions is difficult. It requires conscious effort, institutional support, and moral courage, but it is possible, and it matters. The American medical personnel who treated Fumiko's back pain were not heroes. They were doing their jobs following their professional ethics and military regulations. But in doing so, they demonstrated something important. They demonstrated that even in war, even toward enemies, humanity is possible. Civilization is possible. The rules matter. For Fumiko, sitting on one hip in that examination, being asked by an enemy doctor about her chronic pain, being treated as a patient rather than as an enemy, that moment crystallized this lesson. It was a small moment, medically routine, strategically insignificant, but it was morally profound. It was the moment when she learned that her enemy was more civilized than her own government. It was the moment when she learned that the propaganda had lied. It was the moment when she learned that civilization means treating even your enemies as human beings. That lesson, learned in a POW camp in 1944, stayed with her for the rest of her life. It shaped how she understood the war, how she understood her country's defeat, how she understood the post-war world. It made her a quiet advocate for peace, for international law, for human rights, and it stands as a testament to the power of humane treatment, even in the midst of brutal war. The Americans who maintained Geneva Convention standards for Japanese POWs were not naive idealists. They were practical military personnel fighting a hard war, but they understood that how you treat people in your power says something fundamental about who you are and what you stand for. They chose to stand for civilization. They chose to follow the rules even when their enemy did not. They chose to treat prisoners as human beings even when it would have been easier to treat them as objects or animals. That choice mattered. It mattered strategically, providing intelligence and encouraging surrender. It mattered politically, strengthening American legitimacy, but most importantly, it mattered morally. It demonstrated that American values were real, that democracy and human rights meant something in practice, that civilization could be maintained even under the pressure of total war. For Fumiko Nakamura, and for the other Japanese women who experienced this treatment, it was a lesson they never forgot. They had expected death and found humanity. They had expected barbarism and found civilization. They had expected their enemy to confirm everything the propaganda had told them, and instead their enemy had shattered those lies through simple, consistent, humane treatment. That is the power of maintaining your principles under pressure. That is the power of following the rules even when your enemy does not. That is the power of treating even your enemies as human beings. It is a lesson that remains relevant today in every conflict, in every situation where people have power over others. The test of civilization is not how you treat your friends and allies. It is how you treat people who are completely in your power, people who cannot resist or retaliate, people who are your enemies. The American medical personnel who treated Fumiko's back pain passed that test. They did so not through grand gestures or heroic actions, but through simple professional competence and basic human decency. They asked about her pain. They diagnosed her condition. They provided treatment. They treated her as a patient. In doing so, they taught her more about the difference between civilization and barbarism than any propaganda could. They demonstrated, through action rather than words, what it means to maintain your values under pressure. They showed that true strength includes restraint, that true victory includes maintaining your moral principles. That is the lesson of, I sit on one hip. That is the lesson of the Japanese women POWs, who could not believe how American medics treated them. That is the lesson that Fumiko Nakamura carried with her for the rest of her life, and that she tried to pass on to future generations. It is a lesson worth remembering. These stories matter. They remind us that even in humanity's darkest hours, civilization and compassion can prevail. If you believe these lessons from history are worth preserving, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to keep researching and sharing these forgotten testimonies. And I'm curious, how do you think this story relates to conflicts today? Share your perspective in the comments. Thank you for being part of this community of history learners.